All right. I think we'll get started with the second part. I'm wondering, maybe we should do something special today. Should we do something special? Are any of the questions things that you think we should all talk about or maybe answer a little bit more directly? Any of them that you had struggles with? This is your chance. You get to ask Father all the questions. So one of the things to start with is, why do you think Stephen is spending so much time with Moses? Why is Moses one of these central figures?
He's trying to make the connection to their earlier Jewish tradition, and Moses brought the people out of bondage.
Yes, he's trying to make the connection to the earlier Jewish tradition. Moses is the one who brings the people out of Egypt, and he brings them to Mount Sinai. In a way, Moses is a towering figure of Jewish history that no one else has equaled. No one else is the same as Moses. And who is Stephen talking to at this point? He's talking to the Sanhedrin, these Jewish leaders. And so he cites the example of Moses because Moses is important to them. But there's a bit of a change in some of the ways that he talks about things. There's a few times where you feel it, and you feel this Christian difference, because it's not just about doing these things in the Old Testament, it's about the heart of the relationship. It's about the covenant with God. That it's something that you have to live in. And living in the covenant is not being Jewish or Gentile. It can be, but living in the covenant is something that's faithfulness in your heart. That's something that you have to work at. And you don't live in the covenant just because you follow lots of rules. You live in the covenant because you love the Lord. You live in the covenant because your heart wants to be close to Him. That comes up more toward the end of the speech, but I think it's something that's important even in the beginning. In the Joseph story, one of the things that has puzzled me is what Joseph is a model of. Abraham's kind of our father in faith, like the scriptures talk about that repeatedly in the book of Hebrews. But what is Joseph the model of? And I feel like I'm not exactly sure what I would say. Do you guys have any guesses? Like what?
People talk about forgiveness, like Christ forgives.
Joseph as a model of forgiveness.
His brothers sold him off, but yet ultimately he saves them.
Yeah, that is quite the story, isn't it? Sold into slavery by your brothers? I'm not sure how ready to forgive I would be. It's a good thing I didn't end up back in that generation. The Lord decided that it wasn't going to be good if it was me or you. So a model of forgiveness, anything else? Yeah, as an example of Jesus as a forerunner or a type or an image of the Lord, that Jesus is like Joseph. I wonder a little bit if Joseph is this model of faith in adversity. He's sold into slavery and eventually ends up in prison, right? And then there he speaks, is it to a cook or someone for Pharaoh? And then later in the story, that ends up being how Pharaoh's dream is interpreted. But he has faith in the Lord. He's held up as this example of how God is at work, even though it doesn't look like it very much. Even though it's like, yeah, the Lord is a little bit lacking in the story for a while. He doesn't show up. I wonder if he's an example of perseverance. But it doesn't, calling Abraham our father in faith really seems to fit like a glove, and I don't know what fits like a glove for Joseph. This Joseph. One table was asking about which Joseph it is. This is a Joseph from the book of Genesis. Although the father of Jesus too, like lots of things in the Bible rhyme like that. They're similar. Because the Joseph in the Old Testament interprets the dream of Pharaoh. And if you remember, Joseph, the father of Jesus, has a whole series of dreams that speak meaning to him, that convey God's message. And the Bible definitely seems to play on that. And now Stephen's talking about this Joseph again. Jealousy, he's sold by his jealous brothers. Jealousy has come up several times in the book of Acts. The jealousy of the Sanhedrin, the jealousy of the Jewish leadership, now the jealousy of Joseph's brothers. That can be a real poisonous thing. Joseph is also an image of resurrection, that in a way he was dead. He was in prison, he was captured, things weren't going well. For all intents and purposes, he was dead to the world, and he's brought out of prison by the Lord and entrusted into a place of royal authority. The speech is going to end with Stephen talking about Jesus sitting at the right hand of God. And that's a sign of royal authority. Like it's making this jump all the way to where Jesus is now. And that's going to be part that the leadership rejects even more strongly. Joseph is eventually made known to his brothers and to Pharaoh. In the story, you could say Joseph is loved by his father and has jealous brothers. Jesus, his story is one of being loved by his father, but if you think of the brothers of Jesus being the Jewish people, they're jealous. There's some discord. There's some fighting that's happening between them. So it wants to, it's making this comparison between Joseph and Abraham and Jesus, but then this speech is also taking it a step further because Stephen, who's giving the speech, is going to be like Jesus. Stephen's life and the way that he teaches and preaches is modeled after the preaching of Jesus. So then it goes on, this is on page 49, that another king comes who did not know Joseph, and the people are put into slavery. It notes that they were forced to kill their children as a way of preventing the arrival of Moses. But God is at work again. That Moses is saved in this time of persecution where many babies are being exposed or left out to die. That's often what they would do, is they would just leave them in a field or something until they died. And this story of Moses is different because his mother bears him in secret and then knows that if she keeps him, he's going to die. So she floats him along in the river to Pharaoh's daughter, and Pharaoh's daughter takes him up and raises him as her own. God's plans are bigger. Again, he's still at work. In this story, it doesn't look like it at first, but God has remembered his people. And this whole time, he's been preparing the way for Moses to come. So Moses comes. It notes that he's a beautiful child. And this is an interesting theme because the book returns to it several times. It talked about Stephen's face being radiant, and it talked about this glory of God, the God of glory appearing to Abraham as a kind of physical radiance. And now it talks about Moses as being beautiful even as a child. Lots of people say that their children, or especially their grandchildren, are beautiful. And children are, but some of them are also kind of funny looking. And it's actually quite delightful that just about every grandparent thinks that their grandchildren are the most beautiful on earth. And in some way, it's probably all true. Beauty is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. Parts of it are not quite as much.
For the beholder. Yep. For me.
It's true, but there's some things that are really ugly that lots of people agree about.
Well, but the beholder would not have called it beautiful.
Someday we should go to a modern art museum together and you tell me what you think. Because there is a personal preference in beauty and there's something that's in us, but there's things that are much more beautiful than other things. And part of beauty, I think, is objective in a way. That it's not all subjective, but it's not all objective either, that we like different things, sometimes for different reasons. The story of Moses, it notes that Moses is powerful in word and in deeds. Remember, Moses is the one who does all of these miracles, or he serves at least as a channel of grace for God to do all these miracles in saving his people, in splitting the Red Sea, in all of the signs that are done for Pharaoh as part of the plagues of Egypt. When he's 40, he saves a Hebrew man from his tormentor. And this is a strange note in the story of Moses, because he kills an Egyptian. And it's like, I'm not sure if you're supposed to do that. He doesn't enter the Holy Land in the same way with the rest of the people. Maybe there's repentance. It doesn't talk about it very much. But Stephen uses Moses first as this sign that God is offering deliverance for his people, and he gets rejected. He gets sent away. He's sent away by Pharaoh. He leaves because he's nervous that he's going to be killed. Stephen emphasizes Moses as chosen by God and rejected by his people. That's a theme that is very much in line with the life of Jesus, that Jesus is chosen, he's the beloved Son of God, he's the Messiah, and he's rejected by the people he came to save. But that rejection was actually part of the plan of God the whole time. That the Lord was still at work beyond what they could see. And Stephen was charged with speaking against Moses. He speaks against the law and the temple, these two institutions of Jewish life. And it's fascinating because now he's spent like half of the chapter talking about Moses. You would think that you can't sustain a charge of him speaking against Moses when he's praising Moses very highly. But you can also feel it setting up this uncomfortable position for the Jewish leadership, because their rejection of Jesus is going to be just like the people's rejection of Moses. They're on the wrong side of the story. Right? The people who rejected Moses end up dead in the desert. So then Moses, he talks about the story of the burning bush. He goes, he sees God burning in this bush on Mount Sinai, and the story notes that an angel of the Lord appeared to him. And this, I think, has a couple of different implications, or a couple of different things that we can take from it. The first one is that it doesn't say that in the book of Exodus. It says the Lord himself appeared to Moses, but now it's saying an angel. And part of it is that God works through his creatures. This is something that he doesn't have to do. God can work directly, that's true. But he chooses to work through other beings. He chooses to use angels as messengers. God himself could have appeared to Mary and said, "You will be the mother of my son Jesus." But he doesn't. That's part of their dignity as creatures. That's part of who they are, is that God chooses to work through them. And that's a beautiful thing. This is why we talk about evangelization and being present to the Lord and opening our hearts, because God wants to use you as a channel of His grace. This is what He does. He used Moses, He uses Peter, He uses the apostles, He uses the Blessed Mother, that they become channels of His grace, that He chooses His creatures to be part of His plan. You're not just left out. None of us are. But the second thing is that angels are a part of the story in a way that we don't always think of in the modern world. Sometimes I wonder, I think it's going to be fascinating when you die to see how many times you actually met angels. Because, at least for me, I don't think about it all that often. It's easy to go through a day and not think about the angels of God and what they're doing. Sometimes we think about our guardian angels, sometimes, but how many other angels are there? I think you're going to laugh someday when you realize that an angel was like the squirrel that ran out in front of your car. And because you slowed down so that you didn't hit the squirrel, 3 miles later, you didn't hit the deer that ran across the road because it ran across the road before you got there. And the angel's going to be like, you thought I was a squirrel. But some of that may be very possible. There's all kinds of stories in history of people encountering angels in a way. And I think it's good to try and keep that in our minds. Like, angels are involved in the story, and they're not just like extra, they're intimately involved, and they're everywhere. The angel of the Lord, we're only in the 7th chapter of Acts, and I think already they've broken Peter and the other apostles out of prison more than once. And now he talks about them appearing in the burning bush. And that's just a lot more often than I think of angels. And I'm suspicious that the same thing happens for you. So I think it's good to call to mind, like, God is working through angels, and this is an important part of the story. God reveals His name. That we've talked about before. This is the origin of the Mosaic covenant. This is the Old Testament, or like we've said before, testament is a word that got invented. Testament means covenant. It's this kind of weird translation into Latin from Greek and from Hebrew. But this is the origin of the covenant. And so it's not just that Stephen is talking about Moses, who's this pivotal figure, especially for the Pharisees, because the Pharisees believed that all of their oral traditions about how they do things originated with Moses. That they were pieces of the story that didn't get written in the Bible, but that were part of what they call the oral Torah, this teaching that was handed on. So Moses is sort of considered to be the founding Pharisee, at least by the Pharisees. But it's also that he is the author of the covenant, the person on the other side of the covenant that God makes with the Jewish people. That is the heart of the temple, that is the heart of the worship of the Old Testament. The sacrifices and all of that all relates to this figure of Moses and how God worked through him. And now Stephen's diving into the Mosaic covenant. God will rescue His people. He witnesses their suffering. He knows that they're still in trouble. And in the story of the Gospels, it talks about Jesus in a particular way. That Jesus is coming in the season of Lent, that He suffers and dies to lead us on a new Exodus. Because the problem wasn't the people being in Egypt, the problem is the people living in sin. And so this whole time in the biblical story, what it's kind of saying is that the real problem to be solved, the real exodus that's needed, isn't out of Egypt and into the promised land as a physical piece of land. The real exodus that's needed is out of sin and slavery into a place of the covenant, into a place of freedom. That's something that Jesus brings us. And that's a theme that's picked up in the Gospels themselves. And now Stephen seems to draw on that same kind of idea because he's setting it up. The place where you stand is holy ground. It is good to think about holy places. We think of a church as a holy place, a place where God is present because we have the Blessed Sacrament there. But lots of people are starting to realize that it's also good to have a particular place in your home. A place sometimes with some chairs, sometimes images, sometimes a crucifix, but a place in your home where you pray, because there's something about places that is significant. In Judaism, the place where God's holiness is manifest, the place where His presence is available to people, where they encounter Him, most of the Jews, I think, at this time would have said is the temple in Jerusalem. I think Stephen's arguing against that a little bit. Jesus argues against it quite a bit, because the place of holiness is the place where you encounter God. And that can be in the temple, that the temple is the house of His Father. He says that, but He also talks about, like in the Sermon on the Mount, when you pray, go into your room and close the door and pray in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you. That another place of the covenant is the human heart. Another place where we're meant to encounter the presence of God is inside of us. And that, I think, is a challenge to the Jews as well, because they're like, temple, temple, temple. The speech is taking place in one of the rooms that's part of the temple. That's where the court of the Sanhedrin was. And there's this sort of thought like, God will save us because we have the temple. God will save us because we have this holy place. And it doesn't quite work out that way. God doesn't save you because you're in physical proximity to a holy place. Salvation is being in spiritual proximity. Salvation is allowing the grace of God to work inside of you. So God will rescue them. He sends Moses. Note that Stephen sort of skips over the piece of Moses complaining that he's not a good speaker and all of that stuff in the Old Testament, and how Aaron ultimately gets involved. Moses protests against the Lord that he can't do it. And the Lord finally says, fine, take your brother Aaron. Have him come too. He's good at talking. So Moses performs the signs and wonders and leads the people out. One thing that's interesting is he doesn't spend time with the covenant at Mount Sinai. Like, he spent all this time with the figure of Moses and Moses leading the people out. But the beating heart of the Old Testament is this covenant that they make, and he doesn't really talk about it. He skips that part. He leads the people for 40 years in the desert. Why are they in the desert for 40 years? In the Old Testament, the book of Numbers, why do they end up wandering around for 40 years?
Because they haven't learned their lesson?
Because they haven't learned their lesson. What was kind of the event that happens? They make their way to the Holy Land, and then Moses sends out these people to survey the land and talk about it. And what happens? What was that? The people turn against them. So if you remember, I think there's 12 people that go into the Holy Land to look around, and they end up bringing back this giant thing of grapes. And then they come back to Moses. But when they give their report, only 2 of them say that they can conquer it, that they should go in, that the Lord is with them. The rest of them are worried about the people being giants. They say they looked like grasshoppers. Do you remember this part of the story? So it's in the book of Numbers. I think it's Numbers. Yeah, because I don't think it's in Leviticus. I'm pretty sure the story is in Numbers. It talks about reconnoitering the land. It's the only time in the entire year when you hear about this reconnoitering, and it's not a word that we use very often in modern English. But it is in the Bible. It's in there. It's way back at the beginning, or toward the beginning. But they end up wandering in the desert because they reject the plan of God. He sort of says this whole generation, and a generation in the Bible is 40 years, will die in the desert, except for Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb are the two that say that they should go, that God is with them, that the people, no matter if they're giants or not, that God will protect them and defend them, that this is His will. And so the whole generation dies except for those two. Moses leads the people for 40 years and they wander and they reject God. They have several times of rejection on their wanderings where they complain about not having enough water, and so Moses strikes the rock, and then they complain again and God sends the snakes. And then the snakes bite them, and Moses puts the snake on the pole, makes a bronze image of it, and everyone who looks at the image of the snake will not die. The story that Stephen tells ends up with God promising to raise up a prophet like Moses. Now, in Stephen's mind, who's the prophet like Moses? Jesus is the prophet like Moses, exactly. Jesus, too, does signs and wonders in his life. He is rejected first by his people, and he suffers and dies for their sins. He's rejected again by his people in the preaching of the apostles. That Jesus is working through the apostles. It's the same message. It's the same God. It's the same grace, same signs, same wonders. Now they're rejecting it again. Which is sort of like, if you're thinking about the story, when the people rejected going into the Holy Land when they were supposed to, they all died. Now Stephen's kind of saying, you're rejecting Jesus a second time, so you will all die. They're going to get the picture. Our ancestors were unwilling to obey Moses. They wanted to go back to Egypt. I think one of the funniest lines in the Bible, do you remember what they longed for in Egypt? Deacon got it. The leeks. I don't know why those are so great, but they say that. Why did you lead us out into the desert to die? We were better off in Egypt, where we had, I forget, they say a few things, than the leeks. And so then Stephen's going to become a little bit more belligerent, because what he does next is sort of like, uh-oh, the story's taking a turn. Because the people that reject Moses the second time, what do?
Turn to idolatry.
They turn to idolatry by making the golden calf. You know, so a lot, like, it's like, oh yeah, this is Jewish history. It's really nice. Oh, the people rejected Moses. Oh, they rejected Moses. Oh, the people that rejected Moses made a golden calf. They sinned in idolatry. You know, when you follow the thread of the story, it's like, uh-oh, you just called the Jewish leadership idolatrous for rejecting Jesus twice. Make us gods. They lose trust in the invisible God. They lost patience. God's timing was different than their own. Impatience can be a major issue. We do not know. We do not know where this God is. We do not know who this God is. That is one of the keys in the story of Exodus. Pharaoh does not know God. Pharaoh doesn't recognize who God is. The people are meant to. And so they say, we do not know. They're searching for confidence. Think about this, because this happens all the time. This is something in our lives where the rubber hits the road. They want an answer. They want to know how this is going to work. They want to know the future, how this story ends up. They want to have control. And we end up in this kind of position all the time, where we're praying for something, it feels like the Lord isn't answering us, and we grow impatient, and we just want, it's like, Lord, I just want to know. I just want to know that my kids are going to be okay. I just want to know that they're going to come back to church. I just want to know X. And this is something that Stephen's critiquing the Pharisees for, critiquing the Sanhedrin for. And I think he does it rightly. When Jesus talks about being the way, he's talking about confidence in a person, not confidence in your knowledge. That the Lord will be faithful to his promises, and you don't know when, and you don't know how, but do you trust him? We kind of change the question. Well, God, I trust you to lead me on paths that are safe. God, I trust you that I will arrive at the destination safely. And that's not quite the way that it works. The thing that Jesus talks about is, do you trust in me? Do you trust in my Father? Can you allow that to happen? It's hard to know the paths of God before they happen. This is something that is difficult because the other possibility feels like chaos. It's like, well, if I don't know where I'm going, if I don't know what's going to happen, if I don't know what the future is, then what? How can you prepare? You can't. You could be smacked by a meteor right now. None of you are concerned about it. You could be attacked by a vicious horde of kangaroos. Unlikely, but it could happen. We could have a giant chunk of ice that flies through a window and kills a bunch of us. You don't know. Sometimes people are worried about something. You know, they have a kind of physical illness, or they think they're going to die, and they're very, very concerned about it, and they're working on it, and they walk outside one day and are hit by a bus. You weren't worried about the bus. Like, the reality is we don't know. And this is terribly difficult for us as human people, because one of these consequences of original sin that grinds away inside of our hearts is anxiety about the future. And no matter how much you plan and no matter how well you think you know the path, it's not going to work. Lots of you experience this for Christmas dinner in a way kind of in miniature, right? You buy all this food and you make it all, and then Mother Nature throws a blizzard your way, and then another blizzard, and someone who was coming home doesn't get there, and someone who wanted to be there and couldn't now arrives. You know, you end up with more people than you were planning on, you end up with fewer people than you were planning on, all those kinds of things. And I think that this is a critique that we have to hear. I'm like a lot of you. There's all kinds of things that I would like to control, I would like answers with, because the other end of it seems to be anxiety and concern.